one, and we're good to go. So let's talk about actually Brian's story. Brian's story was interesting for me, no? Because in so many ways, he was talking about like, what does his name mean? His name was somehow inspired by a journalist that his dad was reading. But then later on, what he decided to do was sort of discern how that name started to mean something for him, because he was seeing connections between his experiences on retreat, with his family's history, his competition as a chess player, as a senior high school student whose team was called the Conquerors, you know. So ang nakikita natin dito na gusto ko sana mabigyang pansin ninyo is how a person like Brian suddenly is now taking ownership of a name that was given to him. All of you that shared today and all of you that have been thinking about your names are already doing that. So when we left class last week and we were talking about vocations, the one thing that I wanted you guys to start thinking about is that vocation, yung tinatawag nating calling, is not necessarily something that just sort of drops out of the blue. Parang may himala na lang na nag-appear in front of you, you know, like a Virgin Mary, like, oh, you are called to be this, you are called to be that. It's not that easy. Oh, if only it were that easy, but it isn't. For most of us, it's a matter of being able to figure out, what am I really good at? And then what does society expect of me? Let me repeat that. A calling is a tension between what you want to do because you know you're good at it and it gives you a sense of meaning, and what your family or your society expects you to become. Rarely is the case that the two basically flow into the other. More often than not, most of us spend our lives struggling with asserting what we want to do with our lives and what others expect of us. And so vocation is this constant discernment, this constant balancing act between what you are called to do and what you want to do for yourself and what others expect you to become. Can you give me a thumbs up kung klaro yun with everybody so far? Okay, that's sort of important. So my conversation partners this afternoon, I'm just gonna call you. So it's Alexia Bautista, Angel Dorde, Joshua Nibre, Rafael Santillan, and Ima. Okay, so just sort of stand by. And so taking into consideration the fact that vocation is not just what you want to do, but social expectations, I want to spend the first half of today's lecture focusing on what are these social expectations. So why don't we go and talk about society? And to do that, I'd like to focus on this concept of culture, all right? So this presentation that I have is going to rely on this presentation right here. I'm going to close this up because it's taking a little bit. I think it froze. Let's talk about culture. So, Alexia, are you there? Okay ka lang ba?
Yes po, sir.
Awesome, Alexia. So kung itatanong kita ngayon, just out of the blue, when I say culture, what's the first thing that comes to mind for you? Like, what is culture?
I think language.
Tell me more, like, how does language fit into culture? Tell me, like, what is culture? What is language? How do they relate with each other?
Because like culture is like the identity of a certain group of people.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Stop there because you hit the nail on the head. Culture is fundamentally a way for a group of people to communicate. So bingo, which means that culture can only be possible if it's more than one person. I cannot have a culture that's limited to Michael Campos. Like, it's a Michael Campos culture and I'm just talking to myself. That's a little bit problematic, right? When you're talking about culture, you're talking about shared practices. The word culture actually comes from the root word cult, C-U-L-T, which in Latin simply means a shared practice, shared ritual. So, for example, culture can be as big as the Filipino culture, or it could be as intimate as yung barkada ninyo, meron kayong sariling kultura, meron kayong sariling lengguwahe, meron kayong sariling paraan na pakikipag-ugnayan sa isa't isa. May trip kayo na sinishare ninyo and it's unique to you, which is different from your other friend groups. Now, the reason why I'm emphasizing that is because when we think of culture, it's probably a little bit more complicated than not. So when you think about culture, you're talking about a way of communicating, right? So let's talk about how things communicate and how we know to read certain forms of communication to us. So Alexia, look at this picture or look at this picture in front of you. So these are all students. Can you just describe your first impressions of these students for me? I'm giving you permission to just like go to town with it. First impressions of these students for me. Like, what are
Uh,
some of the things that come to mind? Go.
their uniforms.
Got it? They have uniforms. What else can you assume from that? Go.
They're most likely from a private school,
Good job. Private school. If they're private school, what's another thing you can make assumptions about?
like international school. So it's filled with different students from different places.
Awesome. Okay, so from that picture alone, you made certain assumptions. They're wearing uniforms, which means it's probably a private school, which means it's probably an international school. You're kind of right there. And what does that say about their socioeconomic status? Go to town with it.
They're most likely from like middle and upper classes.
Nicely done. And you're right. Actually, these were my students a couple of years ago here in San Francisco. And at that time, they were wearing, these are actually high school students. And yeah, it's a private school in an expensive city like San Francisco, which means that for the most part, these are people from the upper classes. And it's actually, it's one of these, a little bit of a shishi school. So yeah, we do have a lot of kids coming in from different countries coming in here and studying, right? So ito yung tanong ko sa'yo. Pero, what do you call this? Alexia, you've not actually gone to this school as far as I know, right? So at the end of the day, how do you know? How were you able to pick up these cues so easily? Because you hit the nail on the head. Like, what gave you the idea that these were like, yeah, they're probably private school, they have uniforms, and they're probably from middle upper class students? Why?
Because sir, I've seen like like this before in like my old place. Like may international school po kasi dun. It's like medyo similar po kasi yung get up nila.
So, in short, what you're actually saying is that you have previous experience. In short, you have previous reference points that allow you to make assumptions about them.
Yes, sir.
So what does that say about you, therefore? If you are able to recognize these signifiers, what does it say about your social class? What does it express about your circles, your culture? Can you tell me something about that?
I'm assuming like I'm in the same place as them.
Exactly. Nicely done. So, interestingly enough, the reason why you were able to read them is because it's something that you are familiar with. It may not be identical, but it's something that you can totally read. So, by saying that, you actually were able to read the signs. So, the first element of culture that I want us to be familiar with are signs. In order for the people who occupy the same cultural space to communicate, they have to know the signs. And so something as simple as wearing a uniform. And by the way, I grew up in the Philippines. I went to high school in the Philippines, and I know what those uniforms signify. And you can tell, you and I know this, all of us in this room know this, like certain uniforms have certain cachet, certain uniforms have a certain status. You and I know that, right? And to a certain extent, the way in which you speak, anong klaseng sinasabi, kung Taglish ka, kung Kulay English ka, or whatever that might be, and even accents, all are signs and give us a sense of whether we belong to a culture or we do not. And a collection of signs, when you gather these signs together, like what Alexia noted were uniforms, the way they dress, the ethnicities and the nationalities of the students. Basically, you collect signs and you have codes. So the most basic element of a culture is code. Every culture has a code, and every person in a culture knows the code. So kanina, for example, nung sinasabi ng mga kaklase ninyo yung mga pangalan nila, like, Imac was talking about the fact that his family was so religious, and so therefore it was important to actually organize names that spelled out Cristo. Once you pick up that that's his backstory behind the name Imac, then you can already tell, aha, if Emac's family is religious, you can make certain assumptions about the kind of familial structure from which Emac came from. Because alam mo yung code as a Filipino living in a country that's probably predominantly Catholic. So Emac is probably from a predominantly Catholic stereotypical Filipino family. Klaro ba with everybody so far? Can you give me a thumbs up kung naintindihan niyo ako? And the reason why I'm emphasizing that is because now that you know the code, even you who's living within that space know exactly how you're supposed to behave. And that's what I'm talking about with social expectations. Social expectations. And it's kind of hard to live in a culture. Let's be real, right? Like if your culture is your barkada, cool. Everybody's cool, great. But if one day you fall out of the code or you do something that pushes you out of the code, medyo mahirap to stay in that barkada because at the end of the day, you're not living up to their expectations. And then people basically look at you and say like, "Ay, hindi siya cool." You know, like they wore the wrong pair of jeans. I mean, I'm sort of making fun of this, but think of Mean Girls, right? Like you're not wearing like tights on a Wednesday or whatever the case might be. So that's important for us to take into consideration. So these codes that are built into culture are fundamentally the work or are fundamentally described in a word that we call discourse. I want you to write this word down, discourse. This is why Alexia earlier actually hit the nail on the head from the get-go. Discourse is another word for language. Culture, shared language. Every culture has discourse. Okay. Cloud about with everybody. So I'm going to move on, right? So with that, I want to spend today talking about human societies. What are some of the structures that human societies eventually evolved into that helped us understand what these social expectations are? Social expectations that define our vocation, all right? And I want to make that connection by simply saying that sometimes, if we're not aware of it, these social expectations are part of the social core stories that we are expected to live into. And I'll talk about that specifically today. Because sometimes when you're talking about yung, what does it mean for you to be a decent person? What does it mean for you to be an angel? Sabi nga ni Angel kanina, like, minsan hirap to live up to the name, right? Because there's this expectation that I have to be this good girl. Well, let's unpack what that expectation means and where is it coming from. So what I'd like to do is unpack this discourse around human social expectations. So this week, you're going to be reading a text called Sex at Dawn. I know it sounds like a porn title, but no, it's actually a really funny, very witty sociological study of the formation of human communities. And the authors, Ryan and Yetta, they're a couple. I'm not really sure whether they're married, but they certainly have written a lot of books together. Basically suggested that our human social structures can be divided almost cleanly, and they're not being simplistic about this, between the time in which we were nomadic and the time from which we developed agriculture. So human societies developed from the time we were nomadic to the time we were agriculture-based. According to them, this period of nomadism, this period in which we were pre-agrarian, created a really unique social structure for us. It was more egalitarian, which means it's a little bit more equal. Secondly, it also meant that because people were nomadic, they relied literally on the fruits of their livestock. You didn't actually settle in one land. And the reason why you moved around a lot was because you wanted to make sure that your livestock, yung mga animal from which you draw resources, life, and food, are actually fed. So you follow where the food grows. But because you're also nomadic, it meant that the social structure tended to be more equally shared with everybody. So folks were not defined according to age, rank, or gender. You were defined according to the work that you contributed to the community. Secondly, it also meant that there was no clear line as to what men were supposed to do and what women were supposed to do, which leads to my third point. It meant that for them, sexual relationships tended to be polygynous and polyandrous. So basically, it was much more common to have multiple partners because the more multiple sexual partners you have, Alexia, last question, what would multiple sexual partners actually guarantee for the community?
they continue to reproduce, so there's more
Yeah,
people.
nice. It actually secures the survival of that community because the more people you have, the more people you have working the damn livestock. All right. So, interestingly enough, it defined a really interesting approach to sexual behavior that might seem for us today a little bit foreign. For example, parenthood was shared because it didn't really matter who was the father of the child, because once a child is born, the responsibility for caring for a child now fell on the community. So, secondly, there was no parental investment in the child. That's my child. The investment is the fact that that's our child, and the existence of more children ensures our collective survival. And secondly, as a result of that, sexual behavior tended to be complementary and mutual. So, it wasn't necessarily coupled with any assumptions around whose child and whose partner belongs to whom. Claro ba with everybody so far? So, in a pre agrarian system, sexual behavior, sexual relationships tended to be a little bit more egalitarian. Okay, you're good, Claro? Can you give me a thumbs up kung Claro you're on so far? You're good? Awesome. Okay, great comment, John Matthew. Yes, our inferences on culture are based on how much we are exposed to it or what we are exposed to. Now, interestingly enough, for Ryan and Yeta, so I'm going to ask Angel, okay lang ba ikaw maging conversation partner ko dito?
Yes, sir.
Great. Once we shifted into this agrarian system, and this, according to them, happened around the year 12,000 before the Common Era, interestingly enough, these human societies that initially were moving and were nomadic learned the art of drawing from the resources of the earth. So you learned to plant. Once you learn to plant, you learn to actually realize that in that same geographical place in which you exist, you can draw forth life in cycles. And so that means you don't need to move. What you just need to learn how to do is to cultivate the land within rational, cyclical systems that allowed for the land to rest, lie fallow, and then produce some fruit from which you can live, and then from which you can plant again in another cycle. What that resulted to was a sense of, write this down, ownership. And so ownership became part of human societies. You planted, you established ownership, and before you knew it, what became as important is controlling the source of labor. So, if that were the case, Angel, if you were a landowner and you needed to ensure a source of labor, what's the easiest way from which you can draw labor?
Um,
Yes lang.
labor, sir.
Sa kakukuha ng mga
Yung
trabahadores.
mag yung mga magha-hire ka po, sir, ng
Sabihin natin wala kang
ah,
kapitbahay, ikaw lang mag-isa dyan. Sa ka maghanap ng trabahadores.
mga kamag-anak mo, sir,
Or anak
or
mo.
mga anak mo.
Got it. And so, interestingly enough, the children now became the labor source. And if that were the case, women's bodies became prime possession. Let me repeat that. Once we shifted to agrarian systems, women's bodies became prime possession. Why, Angel? Why did women's bodies suddenly become prime possession?
Kasi yung mga babae po yung may kakayangang manganak po. So, mas madami po sigurong anak, mas marami pong makapagbigay ng labor po para sa pagtatanim, gano'n.
Exactly. In fact, and take into consideration that they didn't have the scientific wherewithal or the scientific sophistication to be able to realize that reproduction necessitated both male and female contribution to the reproductive effort, right? At the end of the day, there was just this sense that women were the source of children, of life, of labor. So here's the effect. The effect were actually twofold. It meant that if women's bodies were now the source of labor, that sense of ownership to land now extended to the ownership of women's bodies. Let me repeat that. That ownership to land now extended to ownership of women's bodies. So according to Ryan and Yeta, that was the beginning of an establishment of what we call a patriarchal system, where women's bodies started becoming controlled. Gets nyo ba? Can you give me a thumbs up kung klaro yun with everybody so far? That's a big claim, because women's bodies became the source of labor. And so that sense of egalitarian, mutual, sexual, what do you call this, relational system of the pre-agrarian framework actually became hierarchical, with male-bodied persons controlling the female body. Secondly, another effect of that is that from this polyamorous, polygynous, polyandrous world, they shifted into monogamy. And why monogamy? Because monogamy ensured the control of women's bodies, ensuring that whoever controls the source of life is guaranteed to have labor and therefore is guaranteed to have wealth. Sexuality no longer was mutual, it became a contentious site of control. So women's bodies became contentious territory. Cloud about with everybody so far. Okay, that's a lot. I'm making a huge claim here. So interestingly enough, why am I trying to emphasize that? Because again, as we shifted into this agrarian system, and again, this relationship between male and female bodies sort of fluctuated, with female bodies now being the site of, by the way, let me just say this, not that only women's bodies were now controlled, but women's bodies took on a really elevated status, because women's bodies were revered for being the source of life, but also equally controlled for being the source of life. So it's almost this extreme sense of women's bodies being revered, but needing to be controlled, because you wanted to ensure access to life, to labor. So sidebar, I will tell you this, and if we have time at the end of this lecture, I'll show you some examples, but some of the earliest artifacts that we have of images of God. Angel, what do you think is the typical gender of the earliest artifacts that we have of images of God?
Male, sir.
That's what we think today. But in those days, it typically were women. In fact, not just women, but women that were very rotund, meaning they're very hefty, meaning these are women that were practically pregnant, with breasts that are so abundant with milk, because they were perceived as essentially the source of life and nourishment. And I'll talk more about that earlier. So the earliest images of divinities tended to be feminine imagery. Make sense with everybody so far? Can you just give me a thumbs up kung klaro yon? Okay, folks, I'm like, I'm going through like 12,000 years of history, or, whatever. Just make sure to stop me if things are confusing. So let's fast forward today. To the extent that women's bodies now became these sites of contention, sites of conflict, sites of control, it's fascinating that our culture today, remember, I started with a question, social expectations. I think you're seeing it now that social expectations are tied to our gender. If you are male-bodied or you are female-bodied, you realize you have different social expectations attached to you. We realize too that even the ways in which your parents chose names for you are gendered. So social expectations are now defined by gender, primarily because of this agrarian shift. Interestingly enough, René Girard, who is this French-American philosopher who teaches down here at Stanford, wrote this book called Violence and the Sacred. And he basically talked about certain taboos that developed around women's bodies. When you talk about taboos, yung tawag dito, ito yung mga pinagbabawalan, right? And the reason why may mga taboo tayo is because yung mga pagbabawal na yon, it's a way to protect the community. And so he started to study, why was it that ancient human societies tended to have taboos around blood? Obviously, Angel, can you take a guess? Why do we have a taboo around blood?
Siguro, sir, kasi pag may nakakita ka po ng blood, mayroong na-injure or may namatay.
Nice. It's always associated with death. Of course, again, the limitations of scientific knowledge basically precluded us from understanding that blood is also the source of life, right? But at the end of the day, most people, when they see blood, they know it portended death. The interesting thing here is that women's bodies became easily associated with blood because of menstruation. Of course, they didn't realize that the menstrual discharge, if you will, is not necessarily the same as blood, but at the end of the day, they realize too that it's cyclical. And they realize that to a certain extent, while blood under a different circumstance can portend death, in women's bodies, blood, the same blood-like substance, can portend life. And so there was a sense of taboo that was associated with menstruation that actually developed over human societies in a variety of ways. And the fascinating thing here is that this taboo around blood literally resulted to an extension of controlling women's bodies. So much so that even till today, the 21st century, there are certain societies that basically say that if a woman were menstruating, they are considered unclean and they have to be separated from the community. This is an example of a menstrual hut in Nepal. If a woman were to enter a period in her life, she had to actually step out. And actually, this comes up every year around winter in news, women dying in the cold because they're exposed essentially to the elements. Even in Judaism today, if you are an observant Jew, you are required as a woman during your time of menstruation, after you finish your menstruation, you have to go through a ritual bath called the mikvah. Literally, it's a bath. You actually have to go to a common bath and you have to immerse yourself in it in ritual to cleanse yourself of this impurity of blood. So I want you guys to see this because now that you're seeing these relationships around bodies and taboos, what you're now starting to realize is that social expectations are related to this ancient concern around ownership, labor, and the attachment of women's bodies to ownership and labor. Can I ask one more question for you, Angel? You know, dito sa Pilipinas, do we have taboos around menstruation? What do you think, Angel? Do we have any taboos around feminine menstruation?
Siguro sir kapag meron ka parang
Right.
tawag dito, mahihiya kang sabihin or
Yes!
yeah,
Di
hindi
ba?
siya hindi
Tama,
po
di
siya
ba?
opo.
Yeah, at saka, di ba, minsan pag nagkaroon ng menstruation ng babae, doon nagpapantalon, di ba? Doon nagsusuot ng mga dark jeans, ganoon. You know, I was sort of telling the other class, so my sister had gone to a school, I don't know if you know the school, it's called Poveda, and they have the ugliest uniform on the face of the planet, but their uniform is essentially like yellow and white. And eventually, I remember when my cousin, who was my sister's classmate, again, years and years ago, when she started menstruating, it seeped through her skirt, right? And of course, if it actually seeps through a yellow skirt, it becomes this bright orange thing. And it's a girls' school. I mean, like, when you think it won't be such a big deal, but it became, interestingly enough, a big deal. So, thank you, John. I'll tell my sister that. Oh, actually, Poveda's uniforms, para ka para ka nakapumot, diba? So anyway, so yeah, that's essentially the point. And that's another question, right? Like, why is it that women's uniforms today essentially cover up women's bodies? So think about where these social expectations also come from, right? And so there are certain movements right now, say in the United States, they call the red tent movement, where women are trying to push back against that shame na sinasabi ni Angel, yung hiya. Why should women be ashamed of their bodies? Where is this coming from? And so the red tent movement is celebrating this part of women's bodies, pushing back against taboos, which have effects for us today. Kasi ang effect ng taboo is oftentimes kind of really far-reaching. You're now controlling women's bodies. Kailan ka lalabas ng bahay? Pag masyadong maikli ang suot ng damit mo, hindi ka karapat-dapat, para kang isang ibon na mababa ang lipad. You know, all of these euphemisms that we use to evoke that this woman broke the cultural codes. Gets nyo ba? Can you give me a thumbs up kung klaro yun with everybody so far? Interesting, right? Thank you, Angel. Joshua, okay lang ba kung ikaw ang maging conversation partner ko?
Yes po.
Great. So interestingly enough, if you look at the effects of these shift from nomadic to agrarian, you will see it even in our culture today. For example, John Paul II, I will actually ask you to read one of his very famous letters, Mulieris Dignitatem, which in English means on the dignity of women, where he talks about different expectations for females and males. And interestingly enough, for John Paul II, he based it from the story in the Bible, the Old Testament, which, if you remember, was written when they were already a kingdom, meaning at that time they were already an agrarian society. So, as an agrarian culture writing about their imaginings of what the world should be like, it would reflect that very clear line between what is appropriate for a woman and what is appropriate for a man. So while Genesis talks about the fact that at the very beginning, God created humanity, there was already a distinction between male and female. And interestingly enough, in one of these stories in Genesis, there's this assumption that man was created. Adam, the word Adama is simply dirt in Hebrew. But from the side of man was born a woman, Isha. So in a sense, when you see that Adama was first created and the side of man, a woman was born, what does that say about how both of them relate with each other? What can you guess, Joshua?
The notion of a woman was derived from man as the template.
Yes, so here, man is the template, the norm, and a woman is a derivative. So I'm actually telling you this because I want you to now start reading these biblical stories written during the agrarian period and starting to think, oh, it's not like God, whoever God is the one that told them what to do, but they're writing stories based on the values of their culture. So of course, if you are writing from within an agrarian context, you will start to focus on these different expectations of what it means to be a man and what it means to be a woman. A woman is a derivation of a man, interestingly enough. So it also therefore meant that even the way they started imagining God reflected that. In the Hebrew scriptures, in the Old Testament, they often portray God in very, very masculine terms, yung sinasabi ni Angel kanina. In fact, in this particular text from Isaiah, God is portrayed as a warrior. The Lord shall go forth as a mighty man. He shall stir up jealousy like a man of war. He shall cry, yea, roar. And yet we forget that there are certain elements in that culture that actually have different understandings of God. So, for example, in Jerusalem, again, the center of the kingdom, the center of this agrarian kingdom, God is often portrayed as a father, but also as a king and also as a mighty warrior. And that's why, for example, in the Gospel of Matthew, when they were talking about Jesus as the promised Messiah, the other word that they often use to describe Jesus is this masculine signifier of a king. If God is a king, then Jesus must also be a king. Again, very masculine signifiers. And yet, interestingly enough, outside of Jerusalem, up north, when the agrarian culture was a little bit less developed, when nobodism still prevailed, there were other images of God that also existed. El Shaddai, the word El means God. If you have a name like Gabriel, Michael, Daniel, it refers to God. And yet we forget that sometimes the word Shaddai also means someone who is abundant, someone that abundantly feeds God's people. And so this image of God was very common outside of Jerusalem. This is an image of God with breasts, a mother. So, ang gusto ko lang makita ninyo is that the more agrarian a social structure is, the more delineated ang role for women and men, and even images of God tended to lean into more masculine representations. But the less agrarian and the more nomadic and the more egalitarian the sexual relationships of women and men, the more images of God tend to be more feminine. And why was it? Because the early experiences of people is that life essentially came forth from women's bodies. glad about with everybody so far. Can you give me a thumbs up if that's okay? I know I'm like throwing out like thousands and thousands of information to all of you guys. Okay lang kayo? I'm just gonna move on, right? So I'm emphasizing all of that because we're talking about the discourse of culture. And I wanted to emphasize that because at the end of the day, when you are talking about social expectations, what's your vocation? Take into consideration that you are also pushing up against eons, thousands of years of cultural development around human societies. And so the discourse around, say, your name, something as simple as your name. Should I be named a masculine? Like, Martin earlier was talking about, like, yeah, it was supposed to be a masculine name, but then I realized a lot of my women friends actually had names like Martin. Okay. Are names even gendered? When did names or when does gender define what we are supposed to become? If I want to become an artist, why can't I become an artist? Why does my father say, no, Mike, you have to be an engineer? Does gender play a role in that? Claro, with folks, that's a lot, right? And that, folks, is the power of culture. That's the power of culture. So let's shift a little bit. May mga tanong ba, by the way? Just put it on chat or whatever, because I know that's a lot that I just threw out at you. Okay. Can you just give me a thumbs up kung okay lang kayo? If folks are doing okay. Just give me a thumbs up if you folks are doing okay. Okay. Thank you. Thank you. So Joshua, you're still my conversation partner. So now what I want to do is talk about, well, okay, now let's talk about how these notions of culture and discourse sort of like fit into the core story, because we're talking about Judeo-Christianity. Like, what about the Bible? I already started picking out on that one. If you want to talk about social expectations in the Bible, the one thing that you and I need to focus on is the relationship of women and men, sexuality. We need to focus on marriage and family because by now, I think you're picking up the clue that expectations of what it means to be a man and expectations of what it means to be a woman is fundamentally tied to this agrarian shift towards ownership and control of women's bodies. So marriage, love, amor, okay, all of those things that we're talking about, kanina, are all tied into how to secure property and how to secure labor. And the Bible, if anything else, is one long story on questions around expectations of women and men and their access to labor and property. Of course, all of those under the guise of God calling us to do something, right? Vocation. So to do that, I want to actually spend today, and then I'll close up on this one, basically exploring two stories in the Old Testament, the story of Hagar and the story of Sarai. And I want to talk about these two women or these two stories regarding how social expectations were sort of imposed on them as women. So to do that, I'm going to go back to the story around Hagar and Sarai. So I'll give you a little bit of a background. So if you remember at the very, very beginning of our conversation, Abram and Sarai were two of the most important figures in the Hebrew imagination of themselves. Abraham was this wealthy owner of livestock and Sarai was his wife. So let's read their story closely, keeping in mind everything that we just learned. Joshua, can you just read this story for us? Can you just do that?
Now Sarai, Abram's wife, had borne him no children, but she had an Egyptian slave named Hagar. So she said to Abram, "The Lord has kept me from having children. Go sleep with my slave. Perhaps I can build a family through her." Abram agreed to what Sarai said. So after Abram had been living in Canaan 10 years, Sarai his wife took her Egyptian slave Hagar and gave her to her husband to be his wife. He slept with Hagar and she conceived. When she knew she was pregnant, she began to despise her mistress. Then Hagar said to Abram, "You're responsible for the wrong I am suffering. I put my slave in your arms, and now that she knows she is pregnant, she despises me. May the Lord judge between you and me." Your slave is in your hands, Abram said. Do with her whatever you think best. Then Sarai mistreated Hagar, so she fled from her. The angel of the Lord found Hagar near a spring in the desert. It was the spring that is beside the road to Shur. And he said, Hagar, slave of Sarai, where have you come from, and where are you going? I am running away from my mistress Sarai, she answered. Then the angel of the Lord told her, Go back to your mistress and submit to her. The angel added, I will increase your descendants so much that they will be too numerous to count.
Good.
The
Let's stop there for a second. Thank you. All right, Rafael, if you notice here, why did Sarai and Hagar have a conflict? Bakit nagka-conflict sila? Rafael, are you there?
Um,
What was
because
the
they
source
have
of their conflict? Yeah, go ahead.
because they have different social cultural status.
No. Just from the story that you read, why did they have a conflict? Ano yung source ng conflict nila?
Wait, sorry sir, I didn't catch the early
Okay,
part.
all right,
I was
just read this and I'll call you again. Imak, what was the source of their conflict?
Uh, the woman got pregnant. I think.
No. Go back to the story. What was the source of their conflict? Bakit sila nag-aaway? All right, since we're running out of time and you guys obviously did not read, I'm gonna have to fill in the gaps for you. They were having a conflict because of the fact that Sarah could not fulfill the social expectation of actually giving birth. That was important in that world. Remember that as a woman, she needed to be able to bear children, because by bearing children, what was she going to guarantee for the tribe? Imak, what's the answer?
To keep the to reproduce. Sorry.
By reproducing, what's that gonna guarantee for the tribe?
To keep it going, to keep the tribe alive.
To ensure their survival. Nicely done. The problem is she couldn't bear children. So what she did was she basically had the wherewithal to ask her slave to sleep with her husband on her behalf so that she can fulfill her social obligation. Pero ito nangyari. When Hagar succeeded in becoming pregnant, what happened was that she eventually became the one who was the source of Sarah's jealousy. So think about the story in you when you think about it, it's a little bit screwed up because there's so much expectation on women to become the bearers of children and therefore labor. Abraham, on the other hand, is just there sitting pretty, owning all of the livestock, right? Think about that for a second. The two women are now at odds with each other. And then secondly, throw in God into the picture. Basically, God was put in a position where God had to choose which of the two were more blessed. Okay, Raphael, I'm assuming you were able to read. Of the two, who do you think God blessed more?
The slave, sir,
Yeah, why?
because she became pregnant.
Yes, exactly, because she became pregnant. So Sarah got the short end of the stick. The poor woman who was the rightful wife of Abraham eventually got the short end of the stick. Hindi na nga siya pwede magkaanak. So she's already sort of like branded as a failure. Her effort to actually have a child through her slave didn't work because now God even favored the slave more. Of course, the story doesn't end there because eventually later on, God does intervene and then Sarah does have her child. But what I want you to see is that the story that you and I have probably heard over and over again is actually really complicated if you're now starting to understand this from the context of this social expectation in this agrarian worldview. The idea that women's bodies are now attached to property and wealth now imposes an unrealistic expectation for women to be childbearers. And if women fail to be childbearers, they are essentially worth nothing in that society. Claro ba with everybody so far? Does that, you guys, can you give me a thumbs up kung klaro yun? So I'm exposing to you some of these complex stories in the Bible. So at the end of the day, when you talk about who is Sarai, Sarah is the upper class, Hagar is the lower class. And when you think about this idea of how even God is portrayed in the story, God is portrayed not in a positive light. God is portrayed as someone that favors the woman that bears a child. Guys, let's stop here and pause for a second, right? What does that mean for us today? If God here favors the woman that bears a child, to what extent does that kind of expectation affect even how we look at women today? Rafael, do you want to try to answer that?
So I think it is expected for us to have a relationship.
Well, okay. So ano nangyayari ngayon sa society natin if women say choose not to have children?
I think they will be despised.
Well, OA naman. Despite talaga, they'll be stoned, they'll be killed to death. Hindi naman siguro. Pero there's still this bias, right? And so what happens is that some of our social expectations today basically are tied to reproduction. We don't really have a lot of time anymore to talk about the other stories. So I'll use that for next week when we start unpacking these stories. But what I really wanted to spend time unpacking for all of you is that when you talk about these social expectations, we started this entire unit talking about vocation. There's an expectation that in order to live a calling, I have to live up to someone's expectations around me. I'm sharing these discussions with you for you to start thinking around how even your gender actually are implicitly conveying expectations of vocation. I love what Kiana actually put there, pro-life and pro-choice discourse. Kiana, do you want to just add on to that a little bit?
I guess the fact that the church is so centered around pro-life, and the fact that you have to continue, and if you, let's say someone wanted an abortion, they would be against it because the whole fact of having pro-life is to like keep reproducing even if you don't want it. So
Right.
yeah, it's just basically the idea that pro-choice seems it's favored in terms of the current world because we're certainly progressing with the idea of women empowerment and the ability for them to reclaim their bodies.
Right. And that's interesting. I love the fact that you use the word reclaiming bodies, right? Because again, when we talked about shifting the world towards this agrarian framework, where suddenly labor became associated with women's bodies, women lost control of their bodies. Are you guys getting what I'm trying to drive at? And so when you talk about the reproductive capacity of women and men, and the fact that these are often associated, say, with labor, these are often associated with who has the ability to control one's choices, all of these come from what Ryan and Yeta are describing as the formation of human discourse and therefore culture. That's a lot, okay? So I just wanted to give you guys a taste of that. So just keep that story of Sarah and Hagar in the back of your heads. When we come back next week, I want to talk about a more controversial story, and that's a story of Judah and Tamar. And let's talk about the power of reproductive expectations. This is a story that very few of us have heard, and the few of us have heard of this actually find this to be profoundly shocking. And yeah, it's in the Bible, but it tells us a lot about the culture from which this story came from. So with that, I want to sort of take pause here kasi ang dami na natin napag-usapan. Are you folks doing okay? Can you give me a thumbs up kung okay kayo? Okay, so I want to move on and basically do a little bit of a logistics, right? So ang reading you this week, you're not going to post anything. All I want you to do is read. But what you will be reading are a little bit extensive. You're going to be reading an excerpt from John Paul II, but everything I talked about human culture today is from Ryan and Yeta. This is it. These are extensive, easy readings, but really interesting. And then a section on René Girard and the taboo against women and violence. That's all I want you to focus on today. But I do want to give you a heads up that in next week, the 20th, right? There is a possibility next week that I may not be able to meet you on a Tuesday. I may have to move our meeting on a Thursday, but please keep an eye out for my email. Right now, we're still meeting on a Tuesday, but if things fall apart in my schedule here, we might have to meet on a Thursday. Claro ba with everybody so far? Can you give me a thumbs up kung claro yon? Okay. And secondly, I did open up your second group engagement, and that has to do with a webinar that we will be having on vocations. I'm going to be moderating that webinar, and I'm actually requiring you to attend. That is on Friday, August 20 from 10 a.m. to noon. And that will be your group project, your second group project. I'll talk more about it, but I'm giving you all the materials right now to be able to engage that webinar with a critical eye. All right. Folks, today was a really, really great discussion. A lot of materials. Props to Alexia, Angel, Joshua, Rafael, and Emac for leading us through this. All right. Adios, Patria Dorada. Bye.
Hi, sir. Thank you.
Ingat kayo lahat. Bye,
Thank you,
guys.
sir.
Take care. Take
Thank you,
care,
sir.
guys.